Welcome to the latest episode of Gowling WLG's Listener Podcast, where we look at a range of topics trending in the legal and commercial landscapes.
Hi, my name's Ben Stansfield, a sustainability lawyer at Gowling WLG based in our London office. And today I'm joined by Graham Reeder, an environmental lawyer based in our Toronto office. In this podcast, Graham and I are going to chat about our experience at New York Climate Week. We were both there a couple of weeks ago, and we're now in this period looking forward to COP30 being held in November in Belém in Brazil. So we're kind of in that period between Christmas and New Year where we're over one party and we're looking forward to the next festival. All COPs have got their particular nuance or interest, and this one's going to be no different. It's the first COP since the new administrations came into power in the US, so there are a lot of eyes on how the rest of the world comes together to keep that climate momentum. And it's also in a fairly remote part of the world. The Amazon isn't particularly easy to get to, so there's a real question as to how many business representatives will attend. And these are topics we might well get onto a little later. But Graham, let's first talk about New York Climate Week. What stood out for you as the themes?
Thanks for having me, Ben. New York Climate Week was an interesting experience. For starters, it was my first Climate Week of any city, and I thought it was an interesting experience. The scale of it really stood out to me. It was quite large, spread out all over the city. There were events in the Bronx, Queens, in all 5 boroughs, I think. And though most things were kind of concentrated in Midtown Manhattan, which is a pretty big area even just that. Ben and I were running around the city in the July heat of September in New York, and I was really impressed by how just the scale and scope of what was going on. There's kind of something for everyone, I think, which is pretty impressive. In terms of actual substantive key topics, I was struck by lots of stuff on nature and biodiversity. AI, of course, is a new theme that everyone's talking about in some way and in very different ways, I think. And energy transition, it remains top of mind for everyone. And then another big one was kind of urban infrastructure, and I think that makes sense given that it's a city-based event.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we're seeing, carbon obviously in finance are at every conference, right? And nature and biodiversity we're seeing sort of as louder and louder, and not so much as environmental goals, but more as economic tools. We should invest in natural capital because there is a return for investors plus climate benefits. But one thing struck me was just how much sort of focus on regenerative agriculture and food production there was, which I hadn't really seen at climate conferences before. And there was also a sort of a move away from climate grandstanding. So people seem to be saying, look, obviously there's a political climate, and we sort of conscious that we don't want to keep sort of banging our climate drum, so we're kind of cracking on and doing these projects now. We're not looking for headlines on the front pages of the newspapers or on the internet. We're just doing stuff. So that kind of move from talking about ambition and publication and moving towards implementation and action, I think was quite encouraging. But which of those themes or how much of that do you think flows through into COP30?
Well, hopefully the energy transition stuff. I would hope that remains kind of a major priority for the COPs, at least, because that kind of stuff cannot happen without government work. I'm also hopeful that some of the nature themes will be coming forward. I think we're past viewing climate in a silo, right? We understand that climate is a force multiplier out there. Understand that it's interconnected with biodiversity, desertification, energy consumption, there isn't really a sustainability issue that climate doesn't touch. So it's the environment we live in. So I do hope that these kinds of things are being considered and understood. I think when you get the kind of big COP years, maybe they kind of strip down the focus and have to focus on a few things that everyone can agree on. Uh, I don't think that this is going to be a big treaty signing year, and so hopefully that's an opportunity for governments to be kind of chugging along on the work for everything to build that consensus for when you get to treaty years or big milestone years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with all of that. I think the sort of whole nature and biodiversity thing, I think will be. I mean, it's obviously, I kind of think of the UNFCCC, the carbon COPs as being much more focused on the sort of emissions and carbon, and then there's the UNCBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity COP, which is sort of focusing on biodiversity. And there's sometimes it's a bit of a blur, and I can kind of see this COP30 focusing, well, not focusing, but certainly addressing nature-based solutions and biodiversity more than perhaps a regular COP, not least because it's in the Amazon, and not least because COP17 the next biodiversity COP isn't until next year. It's every 2 years, isn't it? So you can kind of see with that sort of cycle missing the biodiversity COP and being in Amazon, that there's going to be a focus on that kind of stuff too. And it's I always think it's the sort of the bit about climate change that lands most easily, I think, with the general public. It's yeah. So I think that's an obvious one. I think there's obviously going to be a focus on those sort of national the NDCs, those national climate plans. The determined contributions. I think in September there was talk about having a sort of 100 or so that had been submitted. I think they were due to be submitted in February this year in anticipation. So I think we should get a few more of those through. And then actually before this podcast, I went online to look at the themes. And it's almost embarrassing that it's an A to Z of everything. So you've got adaptation, cities, infrastructure, water, waste, local governments, bioeconomy, circular economy, science, technology, health, jobs, education, culture, justice, human rights, information, integrity, workers, transformation across energy, industry, transport, trade, finance, carbon markets, non-CO2 gases, supporting global push to triple renewable energy, double energy efficiency, forests, oceans, biodiversity, indigenous peoples, local and traditional communities, children, youth, small, medium entrepreneurs, food, agriculture, food systems, food security, fisheries, and family farming. So if there isn't something there, right, that floats your boat.
Apologies for those listening on 2x speed. That was
I mean, it's sort of, I remember I was at COP20 last year, and I sort of described it to people. It's like an ESG conference. It's obviously carbon at the heart, but because climate change impacts absolutely everything, and obviously everything impacts climate change, you do just get this. You can choose your own adventure. There's something for everyone at a COP. It's amazing.
Yeah. For a little bit of context, I used to attend the COPs a number of years ago, kind of between Copenhagen and Paris is when I was going frequently, and going to some of the subsidiary body meetings in between COPs as well in a previous career. And it is striking that there are people from every different social movements, businesses, government representatives, ministers of trade are showing up. Ministers, it's not just your environmental ministers, or your foreign policy ministers. It's cross economy, cross sector, cross struggle for social movements. One of the really impressive, one of those social movements that really struck me was there's a Philippine social movement around debt, called the Jubilee. I'm blanking on exactly it was a Jubilee anti-debt. And they started in the 90s around IMF debt, and they're very involved in the COP space because carbon debt as a concept is something that they're working on and pushing. But yeah, it wouldn't seem totally obvious that a kind of 90s global trade, IMF debt, international institution, social movement would be active at the COPs, but they absolutely are, and it makes complete sense when you think about the scale and scope of what COPs are talking about, and that laundry list. It's a little concerning from a focus perspective, but when you think about how many different people and representatives, there's not going to be a treaty on every one of those things, but it is useful to have to draw people in to be meeting and talking about. And connecting back to New York Climate Week, right? we were remarking on how there's a ton of parallel events going on that you might, want to be going to 3, 4, or 5 different events at the same time in Climate Week, and you have to make choices, and that reflects the maturity of the climate movement. I think that reflects the maturity of the business community, that it's not just a handful of people in one room sharing their ideas. There's enough of us that we can break up into subtopics. We've been around for long enough. We can break into subtopics. You have to make choices. And no matter where you go, there's going to be someone interesting sharing what they're doing and exchanging ideas. And there's value in that.
Yeah. No, I again completely agree. What struck me at previous COPs that I've been to was the diversity of people, both in age. There were people in sort of shorts and t-shirt, look like they've just come from the beach, hanging out, to full 3-piece sort of pinstripe suits and what have you, and everything in between. And the variety of national dress was just an absolute delight to see it as well. So a real range of voices being heard, and I particularly liked one area near the reception that was kind of designated almost for protests, with people with drums and chanting, demanding action. And that's probably quite a good time for us to sort of move into what is a COP, because if you've been to a regular trade show, and it's like, again, slightly different from New York Climate Week, right? Because you had your 1,000 events across all the different boroughs. It, albeit with some kind of focus around Midtown, COPs are really kind of intensely situated, aren't they? So you have your 2 zones. You've got your blue zone, which is where your decision makers and a lot of leading businesses are, and then you have your sort of green zone, which is more like the trade show, and it's a bit sort of perhaps, certainly the ones I went to, perhaps a little bit more cultural as to the local community and the country that's hosting it. But in the blue zone, you had your sort of your big plenary halls and literally dozens of breakout rooms with sort of signs, and you had to have certain accreditations to get into them. I'm sure back in the day you had the right badge, but I didn't have the right badge. But so I spent a lot of time in those side events in the pavilions. So you had, I don't know, it was 70, 80, 100, but each country kind of had, or loads of different countries had their own pavilions, and certain organizations like OPEC, they had a pavilion too. And you could, and these were hubs, right? So you could have, on any given day, you might have 5 or 6 events, 100 seats in a mini sort of auditorium as part of this pavilion, and people putting headphones on, and talking about really fascinating issues. So even if you weren't a policymaker or a representative from government, you had the opportunity to take part in debate and obviously make various connections and share your learning, what you've been doing in the UK for certain clients with the Canadian delegation as well. So it was a real, sounds cliche, but a real sort of melting pot of different ideas and policy and what have you. But it sounds like you've actually been in the room, Graham.
I have, yes. Yeah, when I was much younger than I am today, I was working with a couple nonprofits and some governments, particularly developing country governments, on adaptation issues, and that involved me going and lending support to a number of different government delegations on the kind of what is now a pretty thriving infrastructure, but it was then very new framework on climate change adaptation that was kind of born out of the failures of the Copenhagen climate talks, that folks kind of shifted their attention a little bit more to adaptation and thought, okay, there's some real risk that we're going to have climate impacts here that we need to adapt to. We need to take these seriously. And the Cancun adaptation framework was set up at the COP in Cancun right after Copenhagen, and now there's a fund. There's kind of all kinds of technical bodies and advisory frameworks, and adaptation is now a commonplace understood word, where 10 years ago it was not something most people had heard of, which I think reflects some of the good work they've done, and it's interesting. Many of the people who were negotiators from that time, some of them are still negotiators. Some of them are now in the implementation. They're now implementing the frameworks they were helping set up, which I think is actually really great to see. Someone that I was working for is now with the Global Environment Facility, which is a huge environment fund that was created through the COP process, but is a major sort of source of funding for different emissions reductions and adaptation work in developing countries.
Yeah. Well, it's good to hear you've still got friends in high places, Graham. So one thing that often, well, I used to ask and sort of have been asked myself is, why do businesses care about COPs? Because COPs are, governmental, international leaders of delegations from different governments around the world saying, what are we all going to do to come together and sort of, how are we going to deal with climate change collectively or not? And so businesses aren't in the room, right? They're in the pavilion. They're not sort of necessarily debating in open forum, but to me, it sort of feels like you get that really strong sense of which way the wind is blowing, what the mood is like at policy level, and therefore what, as a big international business, is going to be on your to-do list in 2 or 3 years' time. So, for example, last year we had a lot of discussion around Article 6 and sort of international carbon mechanisms and what have you. So you got that sense, okay, right, well, this is happening. This is the progress. This is the trajectory. This is how I might fit in. Similarly, if I'm doing finance, you can kind of see that it's almost a sort of an early heads up of what the business case is going to be for the investments that your business is going to need to make, right? But I was surprised how accessible many members of various government delegations and leaders were to business. As I was walking around the Blue Zone pavilions, you saw ministers, you saw representatives from government departments who were flitting between the room and sort of the real world, if you like. So I suppose that's one. I don't know if I'm worried about it or concerned about it. I'm certainly interested by it as to how many of those voices will be still in the room at COP30. I know there's sort of some meetings and events which will be quite important in Sao Paulo in the week before, but be interesting to see how many businesses are, if not, they're not allowed to be in the room, but are outside sort of holding up signs and whispering. So that's something I'm going to be looking out for, I think, when we're there.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the final topic of conversation was around, for me anyway, was how businesses stay ahead of these developments. How do they, obviously we've talked about why they should be interested in what goes on at COP30, but how do they sort of move ahead, and how do they prioritize sustainability and nature as they move forward? And I guess, having asked the question, now I'm going to answer it, but I'll give you sort of my initial views. We've had a real flurry of questions, a real focus from a lot of clients on supply chains, how they're weaving sustainability into their supply chains, whether that's in response to, the CSDDD, the due diligence directive in Europe, or whether it was a response to the deforestation regulation. It's knowing about what's in your supply chain, understanding, how you can capture that data, how you can influence, how you can work with your suppliers to do that. But having taken the easy answer, Graham, I'm going to throw it to you for all the tricky stuff around what businesses can do.
Sure. So I think it depends on your business. The worst and the most annoying answer a lawyer can give is it depends. But it, as we saw at Climate Week and as we've seen before at COP, there are some businesses that are all about this stuff. They're attending these things because this is the bread and butter of what they do, right? I was learning about a business that was modeling weather prediction, kind of creating advances in modeling weather prediction. That is a business that is about climate change. That's not every business. There are lots of businesses that have to pay attention to climate change because of the nature of their business model, but their business model is not about climate. So whether you're telecom, whether you're a manufacturer in the garment industry, there, I think that the supply chain piece makes a lot of sense. But I think that you need to be one of the big things you need to be doing is talking to, whether it's your competitors or your allies, you need to be talking to people in your space, up and down your supply chain. You need to be having the conversations about how sustainability and biodiversity and climate are impacting your sector. You need to be having those conversations year round. And COPs or climate weeks can be opportunities to bring those conversations together and to kind of create a focal point. But these are, somebody in your business needs to be thinking about these issues if you're going to stay ahead, because other businesses, we can guarantee you, other businesses, your competitors, they're thinking about it, they're talking about it, and many people are thriving as a result of thinking about it and talking about it because they're staying on the cutting edge.
Yeah, definite. Main takeaway from Climate Week was about how you turn this into a business opportunity, how you can save the world and make money and keep all of your stakeholders, no matter what political side of the coin they're on, happy. And yeah, so listen, Graham, I think that takes us to time. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Sure, both of us send our good thoughts and best wishes to everyone who's going, especially those with the power to make some decisions that will benefit the rest of the globe. And I'm sure as COP30 progresses, we'll be sharing our views.
Yeah, we'll be paying attention, staying part of the conversation.
Perfect.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining Gowling WLG for this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at gowlingwlg.com for more useful insights and resources. And don't forget to subscribe to ensure you join us for our next episode.